Ever feel like you're just drowning in information, really wishing for a shortcut? Like, just point me to what actually matters.
Yeah, that feeling of overload is real.
Well, that's exactly what we try to do here in the deep dive. We wade through it all for you, pull out the core insights, and hopefully give you that understanding without the headache. It's all designed for you, the learner.
And today, we're diving into something pretty intriguing. We're looking at the origins and, well, the influence of this group called the Milner Group. They were, quite powerful, but maybe not widely known.
Right, sort of operating behind the scenes. And we're basing this exploration mainly on Carol Quigley's book, The Anglo-American Establishment. He really digs into this network.
He does, and it's fascinating because Quigley argues they achieved quite a lot, but deliberately kept a low profile. Think overlapping circles of influence hidden within more formal organizations.
Okay, so where do we start? What was the initial spark for this group?
It really traces back to one key intellectual influence, Arnold Toynbee's impact on Alfred Milner.
Now, hang on. This isn't the famous historian Arnold J. Toynbee everyone knows, right?
Good point, no. This is an earlier Arnold Toynbee, an economist and social reformer. He actually died quite young back in 1883.
But his influence on Milner was profound.
Absolutely. Milner himself said something in 1894 like, many men now active in public life are simply working out ideas inspired by him.
Wow. And Milner even recalled meeting him way back in 1873 and said he felt under his spell ever since.
Exactly. Now, if you didn't know about the Milner Group, you might just read those quotes and think, okay, nice tribute to an old mentor. Maybe just sentimentality.
It's more than that.
Quigley argues it's much more. It points to a direct intellectual line. Toynbee's ideas about duty, public service, and maybe reforming society, they really shaped Milner's thinking, which then became, central to the group's whole purpose.
Okay, so Milner's running with these ideas. How does he start pulling people together? What were the early connections like?
Well, initially, Milner was connected to what Quigley calls the Cecil Block.
The Cecil Block sounds very establishment.
It was. Think Lord Salisbury, the prime minister, and his whole network. It was very much based on family ties, aristocracy, the traditional levers of power in Britain at the time. Lots of intermarriage, like the Cecils and the Cavendishes, keeping it in the family, so to speak.
Right, the old guard. People like the fourth Marquess of Salisbury and his sons involved in government.
Precisely. And you had figures like Alfred Lyttelton who connected to both. He was related to the Cecils, but then he married Edith Balfour, who is Arthur Balfour's sister, another key figure, and she later became involved with Milner's circle, too.
So there's some overlap, but Milner's group was different from just being part of the Cecil Block.
Definitely. Milner started bringing people in based more on shared ideas, on a commitment to a particular vision, especially concerning the British Empire and social reform, rather than just family background.
Ah, so a shift from birthright to ideology.
Kind of, yeah. Society was changing, right? Democracy was expanding. There were new economic pressures. Milner seemed to feel you needed a group united by purpose, not just connections, to navigate that. Salisbury's block was maybe more about preserving the old ways. Milner was looking forward, trying to shape the future of the empire.
That makes sense. A different approach for a different time. Now, what about Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate, empire builder? He had his own secret society, didn't he? How does that fit in?
It does fit in, but maybe not how you'd expect. Rhodes did have this secret society idea, aiming to, well, extend British rule. When Rhodes died in 1902, Milner kind of inherited some of the people involved.
Inherited. So he just took over Rhodes's project.
Not really. Quigley makes the point that only one person from Rhodes's original group, a guy named Southern Holland, actually became a really active member of Milner's inner circle later on.
Just one. Okay, so Milner wasn't just stepping into Rhodes's shoes.
No, he fundamentally changed it. After 1902, under Milner's leadership, it became a different beast. Much more focused, perhaps more politically astute, and the key players were largely new people brought in by Milner himself.
People like?
Well, Milner himself, obviously. Then figures like Abe Bailey, a South African financier, Sir George Parkin, who was crucial for the Rhodes Scholarships, Lord Selborne, Jan Smuts from South Africa. A different crowd, united by Milner's vision.
Okay. And this leads us to Milner's Kindergarten. I love that name. What was that all about?
It does sound a bit quaint, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it was incredibly important. This was the nickname for a group of really bright young men, mostly Oxford graduates, that Milner recruited to help him administer South Africa after the Boer War.
Young guys, but talented.
Exceptionally talented. People like Lionel Curtis, Philip Kerr, Robert Brand. names that would become very significant in British public life later on.
So this was like a training ground for future leaders within his network.
Exactly. They worked closely with Milner, absorbed his ideas, and then went on to hold really important positions in government, journalism, finance, international affairs for decades, really.
And there's a strong Oxford connection again, isn't there? Balliol, New College.
Very strong. Many of them came from those colleges. And crucially, a lot of them were associated with All Souls College.
All Souls keeps popping up. It wasn't just any Oxford college, was it?
No, All Souls is unique. It doesn't have undergraduates. It elects fellows based on, well, perceived brilliance, often through a notoriously difficult exam. Getting a fellowship was, and maybe still is, seen as a sign that you were marked for bigger things.
And the Milner Group had a foothold there.
More than a foothold. Quigley suggests the group came to exert a huge amount of influence within All Souls. Not that All Souls was the Milner Group, but many key members were fellows, and it became a central hub for their network. A place to meet, exchange ideas, identify talent.
Right, a sort of intellectual and networking powerhouse for them. Okay, so they've got these personal connections, the academic base. How did they project influence more broadly? Through institutions.
Yes, definitely. Two big examples are the Rhodes Trust and the Bet Railway Fund.
The Rhodes Trust that controls the Rhodes Scholarships, right?
Correct. And after Rhodes' death and Milner's circle taking effective control from around 1902, they ensured the trust, its money, and the prestigious scholarships were, let's say, aligned with their broader goals. Key group members became trustees and secretaries.
So influencing future leaders through the scholarships and the Bet Fund.
Alfred Bitt was another South African mining magnate, very close to Rhodes and Milner. He set up the Bet Railway Trust for infrastructure in Africa. But interestingly, he also endowed a Bet professorship and a lecturership in colonial history at Oxford.
Ah, more academic influence, shaping how the empire's history was taught.
Precisely. It was another way to embed their perspective within the intellectual heart of the establishment. So you're influencing future administrators and shaping the historical narrative itself.
Clever. And these Oxford connections just got stronger over time.
They did. After about 1905, the group really cemented its ties with places like New College, Balliol, and especially All Souls. You had figures like Alfred Zimmern joining the circle.
Zimmern wrote The Greek Commonwealth, right? Influential book.
Very. It had a big impact on the group's thinking about political structures, although Zimmern later disagreed with them on foreign policy, particularly appeasement.
And others, like R.S. Raitt.
Raitt was another associate, based at New College. He focused on the historical union between England and Scotland, seeing it perhaps as a model for Ireland. And then there was Reginald Coupland, later the Bate professor, another key All Souls figure.
So many All Souls connections.
It's quite remarkable. Quigley lists quite a few All Souls fellows who were at least in the group's outer circles. It really underscores how central Oxford and particularly All Souls was to their network.
And they even got involved with the Dictionary of National Biography. How did that happen?
Yeah, that's quite something. They managed to gain influence over the DNB, partly through members like H.W.C. Davis and J.R.H. Weaver, who were editors. It gave them a subtle way to shape how historical figures and events were presented.
Controlling the narrative again. Okay, let's shift gears to the media. The Times newspaper comes up a lot. How important was that for the Milner Group?
Hugely important. The Times was arguably the most influential newspaper in Britain, maybe the world, at that time. And the Milner Group had deep connections within it.
People like Flora Shaw.
Flora Shaw, yes. Before she married Lord Lugard, she was the colonial editor. Incredibly well connected, very close to Rhodes, very close to the colonial office. Quigley even says she had secret communication lines set up.
Wow. Direct lines bypassing editors.
Apparently so. Then there was Valentine Kyrle, head of the Foreign Department for a long time.
He was quite anti-German, wasn't he?
Increasingly so, yes. Especially after the Kruger telegram incident. His views heavily influenced the paper's foreign policy line, pushing for resistance to Germany, supporting the Boer War.
And Geoffrey Dawson, the editor for much of this period.
Dawson was absolutely central. A member of the Inner Circle, a fellow of All Souls. Under him, the Times wasn't really aimed at mass circulation. Its goal was to influence the influential, the people in power, the policymakers, the thinkers.
How did they do that, specifically?
It was often quite coordinated. You might see an idea discussed by a group member in government, then maybe a Chatham House paper would come out supporting it. Chatham House being another institution they were heavily involved in, then perhaps a book by an Oxford historian linked to the group. And the Times would often weigh in editorially, reinforcing the message. Sometimes anonymously written pieces by group members would appear across these different platforms.
A multi-pronged approach to shaping opinion among the elite. Very sophisticated. And what about the Round Table Journal? That was their own publication, wasn't it?
Yes, the Round Table was founded by the group around 1910. It was explicitly designed to promote their core ideas initially. The big idea was imperial federation, a closer political union of the empire.
Federation didn't quite happen, though.
No, it didn't. Later, the focus shifted more towards imperial cooperation. But the journal was key for disseminating their views, and it was famously anonymous.
Why anonymous?
Well, the official reason was so the ideas would be judged on merit, not on the author's name. Practically, in the early days, the main writers were relatively unknown, so maybe it added weight. Later, as members became prominent politicians, anonymity allowed them to speak more freely, perhaps.
But it wasn't really a journal of diverse opinions, despite claims otherwise.
Quigley argues no. He says despite allowing some differing views later on, the core contributors were overwhelmingly in agreement on the big goals: strengthening the empire, social reform at home. They had a shared outlook.
And what was that shared outlook, that historical perspective?
They saw history as this grand struggle. On one side, you had autocracy, darkness, oppression. On the other, you had Commonwealth, their term meaning freedom, progress, constitutional government. And Britain, in their view, was the leading champion of Commonwealth, like Athens in ancient Greece.
A rather self-confident view.
Very. Their mission, as they saw it, was to advance these principles, defend civilization against autocracy, whether in Europe, Asia, or Africa.
Okay, that sets the stage. How did this group, with this worldview, operate during World War I? Did their influence grow or shrink?
It's sometimes hard to untangle them completely from the older Cecil Bloch influence, especially early in the war. But generally, the Milner Group's influence grew, particularly under the Lloyd George coalition government from late 1916 onwards.
Lloyd George brought them in.
Very much so. Members held key posts. They were in the War Cabinet, the Imperial War Cabinet. Think Milner himself as Secretary of State for War at a crucial time. Lord Selborne dealing with agriculture policy. They were right at the heart of the war effort.
And planning for afterwards.
Absolutely. As the war ended, their focus shifted heavily to the peace settlement. Group members were all over the Foreign Office, deeply involved in planning for the Paris Peace Conference.
So the war actually solidified their position. What about the League of Nations, born out of that peace conference? How did the group view that?
It was complex. Publicly, they generally supported the idea of the League, international cooperation, but privately, many were quite skeptical.
Skeptical why?
They worried about its structure, its effectiveness. A big issue was the U.S. not joining. They were also concerned Britain might get dragged into conflicts or commitments it couldn't handle through the League's collective security clauses.
So a cautious approach. And the Treaty of Versailles, especially concerning Germany.
Well, despite some members being very anti-German during the war, the group quite quickly started pushing for revision of the treaty. They felt it was too harsh on Germany.
Really? Why the change of heart?
Fear, mostly. Fear that crippling Germany economically would lead to chaos, maybe revolution, which could destabilize all of Europe. Jan Smuts made a famous speech in 1923 arguing for a more generous policy, comparing it to how France was treated after Napoleon.
Trying to reintegrate Germany, not punish it indefinitely.
That seemed to be the thinking. Group members were involved in things like the Reparations Commission, trying to sort out German debt. They also played a role in getting the Dominions to oppose things like the Geneva Protocol, which they felt might overcommit the empire.
This sounds like the beginnings of, well, appeasement? Did that view carry into the 1930s with Hitler?
It certainly contributed to the climate of appeasement, yes. The desire to avoid war at almost any cost was strong. Plus, some of the groups saw a rearmed Germany as a potential buffer against Soviet Russia, against communism.
So they influenced that policy.
They were definitely involved. Think of Lord Halifax, a key group member, meeting with Hitler. The Hoare-Laval Plan, involving another member, Samuel Hoare, was a classic example of trying to appease an aggressor.
But not everyone in the group agreed. You mentioned Zimmern earlier.
Exactly. It wasn't monolithic. Arnold Toynbee, the historian son of the original Toynbee influence, who was associated with the group through Chatham House, became a strong critic of appeasement.
And did they know about resistance to Hitler within Germany?
Quickly suggests they had some awareness, yeah. Connections possibly through former Rhodes scholars, maybe even links to figures like Helmuth von Moltke, who was part of the anti-Nazi Kreisau Circle.
It's complex. So significant influence, but also internal disagreements and complexities. Okay, let's go back to the empire. Their big dream of federation didn't happen. How did they adapt as the Commonwealth emerged?
They were pragmatic.
Hmm.
Federation wasn't achievable, so they pivoted to promoting close cooperation between Britain and the Dominions. They essentially helped shape the Commonwealth idea, even if it was their first choice.
Still trying to maintain unity, just in a different form.
Yes, they continued to hold key posts, like colonial secretary, dominion secretary, influencing policy from within. There was often this dual attitude, publicly supporting the existing dominion status, privately hoping for closer ties down the line.
And they were involved in specific issues, like the mandates for former German colonies.
Yes, Lionel Curtis, a core kindergarten member, was instrumental in developing the mandate system which the League of Nations adopted. It was a way to manage those territories, supposedly under international supervision, but often effectively under British or French control.
And things like Palestine, Ireland.
They were involved in those too, though perspectives within the group could vary. Curtis, for instance, was a strong advocate for Irish devolution, applying their Commonwealth ideas there. The Palestine situation was obviously incredibly complex, with differing views even within the group.
So they adapted their grand vision and were deeply involved in the nuts and bolts of managing the changing empire. We mentioned Chatham House earlier, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Can you expand on its connection?
Chatham House was almost a sister organization, born out of the same post-World War I desire to understand international relations, involving many of the same people from the Paris Peace Conference delegation.
So founded by the group, essentially.
Heavily influenced and led by group members, certainly. It became a major center for research, conferences, publications on foreign affairs. And as we noted during World War II, it basically became the Foreign Office's research department, the Foreign Research and Press Service, another key institutional base for them.
It really is a web of interconnected influence. What about India? How did the Milner Group shape policy there?
Their influence in India was profound,
Hmm.
really significant throughout the 20th century, right up until independence.
How so?
Well, look at almost any major commission or committee set up to examine India's constitution or future Simon Commission, roundtable conferences, Lothian Committee, you'll find key Milner Group members involved.
Shaping the reforms, the legislation.
Exactly. People like Lord Lothian, Philip Kerr, Lord Halifax, Edward Wood, who was Viceroy, Leopold Amory, who was Secretary of State for India during World War II. They were consistently in positions to steer policy.
And what was their general direction for India? Holding on tight.
Not indefinitely. Their approach generally was gradual evolution towards self-government within the Commonwealth. They talked about principles of equality, responsible government. They drove the roundtable conferences trying to find a constitutional settlement.
So they were pushing for change, albeit controlled change.
Yes. By the time Labor came to power in 1945 and granted independence, you could argue the path had already been largely set by the frameworks and discussions dominated by the Milner Group for decades.
Their long game shaped the end game.
Okay, finally, just looking at pure political power in Britain between the wars, how many were actually in government?
Quite a lot. Quigley estimates that in the 1920s and 30s, members of the group and their close relatives often held a significant chunk of cabinet positions, maybe up to a fifth at times.
A fifth of the cabinet. That's substantial. It is. Figures we've mentioned like Amory, Halifax, Hoare, Kerr, Lothian, Selborne, they were consistently in and around the top jobs, plus others in important ministerial and official roles. It shows real, tangible political weight.
It's an incredible picture of sustained, interconnected influence across so many areas. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways for you listening in?
I think the key thing is understanding that this network, the Milner Group, existed and was incredibly influential, even if it wasn't always visible. They operated across government, media, academia, especially Oxford, shaping British foreign and imperial policy for, well, the best part of half a century.
Yeah, it wasn't just one person or one institution, but this web, this interconnected group pushing a particular evolving vision. From that initial spark from Toynbee through Rhodes, the kindergarten, All Souls, the Times, Chatham House. It's quite a story.
It really is, and it makes you think, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, it prompts a question for you, the listener. How might similar networks, informal, ideologically driven groups operate today in our world with instant information, globalized politics? What does hidden influence look like now?
That's a fascinating thought to leave people with. How are decisions really shaped behind the headlines? Definitely something to ponder.
We hope this dive into Quigley's analysis of the Milner Group has given you some food for thought on that. Encourage you to look deeper into these figures and events yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.